Hey guys, this is David Payton from New York. Welcome to Boring History Documentary. Tonight, we are stepping into a world where alcohol was ordinary, familiar, and in many places almost impossible to avoid. But the real story is more interesting than the old joke that everyone in the Middle Ages was simply wandering around drunk all day. They were not. At least, not in the way modern people usually imagine. What looks careless from a distance often had a practical logic behind it, and what sounds like a simple habit turns out to be tied to work, diet, religion, trade, and the fragile routines of everyday survival. This is one of those subjects that seems amusing at first, but the closer you look, the more it reveals about how medieval people actually lived, what they feared, and what their world required from them. And before we settle in, if you enjoy calm, thoughtful long-form history that takes its time and tries to explain not just what happened but why it made sense to the people living through it, please consider subscribing. That is really what this channel is for. And if you'd like to support the video, a simple like is always appreciated. It helps more people find careful history without all the noise. As always, feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and what history topic you'd like us to explore in a future documentary. To begin, we have to clear away one of the most repeated claims about medieval life. You will often hear that people drank ale because water was unsafe. There is some truth in that idea, but not enough to explain the whole picture. Medieval people did drink water. They drew it from wells, springs, streams, cisterns, and rivers. In some places, the supply was decent. In others, it was poor. Clean water certainly mattered, and contaminated water certainly existed, especially in crowded towns. But the reason alcohol became so central was larger than simple fear of water. Beer, ale, cider, and wine were not merely substitutes for drinking water. They were woven into the economy of the household, the rhythm of labor, the structure of hospitality, and the expectations of daily life. In much of medieval Europe, especially in the north, ale was not an indulgence reserved for special occasions. It was food as much as drink. That may sound strange to a modern listener, but in a world of hard manual labor, uncertain harvests, and limited variety, liquid calories mattered. Grain could be baked into bread, turned into porridge, or brewed into ale. Each option had its place. Ale carried nutrition, especially when it was thick, cloudy, and freshly made. It could provide energy to laborers, servants, and travelers. It could be prepared in different strengths. Stronger drink might appear at feasts or in elite households, but weaker ale, often called small ale by later writers, was consumed by adults and children alike because it was mild, filling, and familiar. That is where the first surprise appears. When we say medieval people were drunk most of the time, we are using a modern image of alcohol on a very different kind of drink. Much of what ordinary people consumed was weak by modern standards. Not harmless, not non-alcoholic, but often much lighter than wine or distilled spirits. Distillation existed in some form by the later Middle Ages, but hard liquor was not the everyday village drink that it would become in later centuries. The daily reality for many households was not constant heavy intoxication. It was frequent, routine, low-level consumption of brewed drinks that sat somewhere between nourishment and refreshment. That distinction matters, because it shifts the story from medieval recklessness to medieval practicality. Brewing was also deeply domestic. In many communities, especially earlier in the medieval period, ale-making was ordinary household work, often carried out by women. A family might brew for its own use and sometimes for sale. The line between domestic production and commercial exchange could be surprisingly thin. If a batch turned out well, neighbors might buy some. If demand grew, a household could build a reputation. In English towns, for example, women known later as alewives appear regularly in records, not as romantic figures from folklore, but as practical participants in local economies. This means alcohol was not just consumed everywhere. It was made everywhere. Its presence in daily life began long before the cup was raised. It started with stored grain, yeast, vessels, labor, timing, and knowledge passed through routine. And routine mattered because medieval life was seasonal in a way many modern lives no longer are. Harvests arrived at certain times. Grain had to last. Freshness mattered. Beer and ale did not always keep well. That encouraged regular production and regular drinking. In households, monasteries, manors, and urban workshops, people were not thinking in terms of occasional recreational use. They were thinking in terms of how to turn staple crops into something usable, sustaining, and socially expected. A laborer in the field, a servant in a great household, a monk in a religious house, and a craftsman in a town all inhabited worlds where a daily ration of drink might be counted as part of normal provision. In some settings, it was literally part of wages or customary allowance. This takes us to another deeper reason alcohol was so common. Medieval work was physically demanding, and much of it was collective. Harvesting, plowing, hauling, baking, building, brewing, washing, spinning, and smithing required energy and coordination. Shared drink helped structure breaks, meals, and moments of rest. It also reinforced hierarchy and belonging. Lords provided drink at feasts. Monasteries distributed it according to rule and rank. Employers and masters offered it as part of the household economy. Hospitality toward guests often involved the immediate offer of ale or wine. To refuse such customs too sharply could seem rude, suspicious, or socially awkward. So drinking was not just individual choice. It was part of participation in society. Religion, too, gave alcohol a place of extraordinary respectability. Medieval Christianity did not treat all drinking as suspect. Quite the opposite. Wine stood at the center of the Massachusetts monasteries' cultivated vineyards where the climate allowed it, and where it did not, they brewed ale or beer with considerable skill. Monastic communities became important centers of production, improvement, and record-keeping. There was criticism of drunkenness, certainly. Preachers warned against excess. Moralists condemned the tavern when it became a site of vice, disorder, gambling, or neglect. But moderate drinking itself was not some shadowy habit at the edge of respectable life. It sat comfortably inside the moral world of medieval Europe, so long as it remained within accepted bounds. That makes the story more complex than modern assumptions often allow. Medieval society could condemn intoxication while still normalizing daily alcohol consumption. And here we reach a useful reversal. The tavern, which many people imagine as the heart of this story, was only part of it. The more important setting was the home. Most drinking happened not in cinematic halls full of shouting strangers, but in ordinary domestic space. People brewed, stored, served, and consumed drink within the household. The tavern and the alehouse mattered, especially in towns, on roads, and in moments of social gathering, but alcohol's real power came from its quiet familiarity. It was there at breakfast in some households, there with noon meals, there after labor, there in hospitality, there in ritual. Because it was common, it could disappear into the background. And things that disappear into the background often shape a society more deeply than the things reserved for spectacle. Class also changed the picture. The poor, the middling, and the wealthy did not all drink the same things. In wine-producing regions of southern Europe, wine was everyday and abundant in ways that northerners might have envied. In the north, ale and beer dominated, with beer gradually becoming more significant as hopped brewing spread more widely. Elites had access to better varieties, imported vintages, and stronger drinks. They could display status through what they served. Yet even here the deeper pattern remained the same. Drink marked identity, rank, generosity, and household order. A noble feast, a monastery refectory, and a peasant table all used alcohol differently, but none treated it as especially unusual. Children drinking weak ale is another detail that unsettles modern people, and with good reason. Yet this, too, belonged to a world with different assumptions. A mild brewed drink could be safer in some conditions than stagnant water, easier on storage, and entirely normal in family life. That does not mean medieval parents were indifferent or reckless in the modern sense. It means they lived in a system where fermentation was ordinary technology. Today we think of alcohol mainly in terms of choice, pleasure, and legal boundaries. Medieval people often encountered it as part of subsistence itself. The cup on the table was connected to grain stores, fuel, labor, vessels, and the household's ability to provision itself through the year. There is also a broader emotional truth here. Medieval life was full of uncertainty. Harvest failure, disease, bad weather, inflation, war, and local shortage could disrupt even modest stability. In that sense, alcohol also offered comfort. Not necessarily constant escape, but a familiar softening of hardship, a warm and predictable element in a cold and unpredictable world. To drink together was to affirm that ordinary life was still continuing. Weddings, saints' days, fairs, funerals, market gatherings, and seasonal festivals all gave drink ceremonial force. It helped people mark time. It signaled ordinary continuity and special occasion alike. Still, we should resist romanticizing it. Alcohol could bring real problems. Authorities fined dishonest brewers, regulated prices, inspected measures, and worried about disorderly alehouses. Preachers and chroniclers could describe ruinous excess. Domestic violence, poverty worsened by drinking, negligence, and public disorder were not unknown. Medieval people did not need modern medicine to recognize that drunkenness could humiliate a person, damage a household, or disturb a community. So when they drank often, they did so inside a culture that both accepted and watched alcohol carefully. That balance is easy to miss. It was common but not morally invisible, familiar but still regulated, nourishing yet potentially dangerous. Perhaps that is the deepest reason this topic holds attention. It begins with a funny modern question, why were medieval people drunk all the time, and ends by revealing something much more serious. They were not simply drunk. They were adapted to a world in which brewing converted fragile resources into everyday sustenance, where weak alcohol sat close to food, where social life depended on shared customs, and where practical habits could look strange centuries later. The stereotype survives because it contains a grain of truth. Medieval people did drink constantly by modern standards. But the meaning of that drinking was very different from what the stereotype implies. And once you see that, the medieval world becomes a little less distant. Its people stop looking like caricatures from a dark and dirty past and start looking like human beings working with the tools, beliefs, and risks available to them. They brewed because grain had to be used wisely. They drank because calories mattered, because labor was hard, because hospitality mattered, because religion sanctified certain forms of drink, and because ordinary life was built from habits repeated so often that no one needed to explain them. Sometimes the best history comes from noticing exactly those habits. If we continue looking a little deeper, another important part of the answer lies in the difference between medieval town life and medieval rural life. These are often blended together in modern imagination, but they created very different drinking cultures. In the countryside, much of life revolved around the household, the manor, the village field system, and the agricultural year. Drink was tied to production close to home. In towns, by contrast, density changed everything. More people lived close together, more goods were bought and sold, and more strangers passed through. That meant a greater role for commercial brewing, alehouses, taverns, guild regulation, and civic oversight. Urban authorities worried about quality, fraud, sanitation, licensing, and unrest. In other words, once drink moved beyond the household and into the marketplace, it became a public matter. This is one of the quieter but more revealing shifts in medieval society. Alcohol was not only a personal habit or domestic staple. It also became a taxable good, a regulated product, and a small but constant source of urban concern. Officials checked measures so customers were not cheated. They fined brewers for selling poor drink. They watched alehouses because these places attracted conversation, rumor, arguments, games, and sometimes trouble. A place where people gathered to drink was also a place where information moved. News, complaints, grievances, and gossip all circulated there. That made such places socially important, but also slightly unsettling to those who preferred order. So when we talk about medieval drinking, we are also talking about medieval communication, medieval regulation, and even medieval anxiety about uncontrolled gathering. And yet, even here, the story remains more measured than the stereotype suggests. An alehouse was not automatically a den of chaos. Very often it was simply one of the few available social spaces for ordinary people. Medieval life could be harshly structured by rank, labor, and obligation. There were not many places where common people could gather with a little ease. An alehouse offered warmth, familiarity, and temporary relief from the isolation of work. For travelers, it might provide food, shelter, and conversation. For local residents, it might be the nearest thing to a community room. Once again, what can look like mere indulgence begins to look more like infrastructure. Another question naturally follows. If drinking was so common, how drunk did people actually become? The answer is difficult because medieval records were not written to satisfy modern curiosity, and they rarely describe ordinary bodily experience in the detail we might like. But we can make a careful distinction. Frequent consumption is not the same as constant intoxication. Much depended on strength, quantity, time of day, type of labor, and individual tolerance. A person drinking weak ale with meals throughout the day might remain functional in a way that would surprise a modern observer. That does not mean no one became very drunk. Of course some did. Feast days, celebrations, and tavern culture could produce obvious excess. But if we imagine a village full of people stumbling through every task in a haze, we lose sight of the practical reality that fields had to be worked, livestock tended, tools repaired, children watched, bread baked, and obligations met. Medieval life left little room for total helplessness as a daily norm. There is also the matter of status and self-control. For elites, drinking could be an expression of magnificence, but dignity still mattered. A lord was expected to be generous, yet not ridiculous. Clergy might consume alcohol as part of ordinary life, yet sermons and moral writings repeatedly warned against immoderation. Monastic rules varied, but many showed the same tension. Drink was permitted, even expected, but excess threatened discipline. This repeated pattern tells us something very important. Medieval society accepted alcohol deeply, but never entirely trusted it. That tension gave rise to warnings, jokes, punishments, and rituals of moderation. In a strange way, that sounds rather modern. The substances differ, the social setting differs, but the basic human problem remains recognizable. One of the most interesting details is how often medieval drinking intersected with gender. Brewing, especially in its smaller-scale domestic form, was for long periods closely connected with women's work. That meant women were central not only to household nourishment, but also to the daily production of a substance everyone relied upon. Over time, especially as brewing became larger, more urban, and more capital-intensive in certain regions, men increasingly dominated the commercial side of the trade. This shift is easy to overlook, but it tells a wider story about medieval and early post-medieval economies. When brewing was small, local, and domestic, women often stood near the center of it. When it became more profitable and organized at scale, authority and profit could move elsewhere. A simple cup of ale, then, can quietly reveal changing patterns of work, property, and social power. The same is true of technology. Not all medieval drink was the same, and the spread of different brewing techniques mattered. In some regions, unhopped ale remained common for a long time. In others, hopped beer gained ground because it kept better and traveled more easily. That may sound like a technical detail, but it changed commercial life. A drink that keeps longer can be traded further. A product that travels better can support larger producers. And once longer-lasting beer becomes more practical, urban markets can expand in new ways. What begins as a detail of flavor and preservation becomes a story about trade networks, town economies, and shifting preferences. This is another good example of how a seemingly narrow subject opens onto a much bigger landscape. Climate and geography shaped all of this as well. Wine flourished where grapes could be grown reliably, above all in much of southern and central Europe. In those regions, wine might be ordinary rather than luxurious. In colder northern areas, wine was often imported, more expensive, and more closely tied to status or church use, while ale and beer remained the common drinks of everyday life. Cider also had its place in certain regions where apples were plentiful. So there was never a single medieval drinking culture. There were many, each shaped by land, weather, crops, trade routes, and custom. The phrase medieval people can be useful, but it can also flatten important differences. A peasant household in England, a monastery in Germany, a merchant family in France, and a village in northern Spain did not live identical material lives, even if they shared certain broad patterns. That broader perspective helps explain why the myth remains so attractive. Modern audiences like simple answers, especially when the answer confirms a feeling that the past was bizarre, primitive, or somehow less rational than the present. The image of everyone being drunk all the time is memorable because it is easy, but good history often begins where easy answers start to break down. Medieval people were making rational choices inside the limits of their own world. They used fermentation not because they lacked discipline, but because fermentation was useful. It preserved value, created calories, improved storage, reinforced social bonds, and turned agricultural products into something highly practical. What seems odd from one angle looks entirely reasonable from another. There is a similar misunderstanding in the way we talk about pleasure. We sometimes assume that if a medieval habit had a practical purpose, then it must have been joyless. But people do not live by utility alone. Medieval drink could be nourishing, socially necessary, and still genuinely enjoyable. Flavor mattered. Reputation mattered. Feast days mattered. Seasonal abundance mattered. The emotional relief of shared food and drink at the end of labor mattered. In a world with fewer comforts, small pleasures often carried unusual weight. This is worth remembering because it keeps the people of the past human. They were not merely enduring life. They were also trying to make it bearable, meaningful, and at times pleasant. And then there is the role of ceremony. Drinking marked transitions. It could seal agreements, welcome guests, celebrate marriages, accompany festivals, and define communal identity. Even when the quantities were modest, the symbolism could be strong. A cup offered to a guest was not just hydration. It was recognition. A shared drink among workers was not just refreshment. It was temporary equality in the midst of hierarchy. A monastic ration was not just sustenance. It was part of an ordered life governed by rule. These details remind us that medieval society was built from repeated acts that carried social meaning. Drink endured not simply because people wanted alcohol, but because it helped organize how they related to one another. There is also a darker edge that should not be ignored, though it needs to be handled with care. Dependence, waste, neglect, and disorder existed in the medieval world just as they do in any age. Some households certainly suffered from excessive drinking. Some communities struggled with unruly alehouses. Some moral writings describe drinking as a gateway to other failures of conduct. It would be false to turn medieval alcohol culture into something entirely harmless or benign. But it would be equally false to treat these problems as proof that all drinking was pathological. What we see instead is a society trying to live with a substance that was at once staple, comfort, commodity, and risk. That balance, once again, feels unexpectedly familiar. Perhaps the most useful conclusion is this. Medieval people were not drunk most of the time because they were foolish. They drank often because alcohol occupied a place in their society that water, tea, coffee, or soft drinks occupy in other societies, while also carrying nutritional, economic, and ritual functions of its own. Their drinking habits were formed by agriculture, labor, scarcity, religion, technology, and local custom. The real surprise is not that they drank so much. The real surprise is how organized, normal, and sensible that drinking often was when viewed from inside their world. And maybe that is one of the quiet pleasures of history. A question that begins with amusement can end in sympathy. The farther we move from the caricature, the closer we come to the texture of real life. The smell of mash and grain, the work of carrying water, the worry over spoiled drink, the comfort of a shared cup after labor, the expectation placed upon a host, the caution of a preacher, the note of a town official recording a fine against a careless brewer. Taken together, those ordinary fragments say more about the Middle Ages than the old joke ever could. So before we leave this world behind for the night, I'd be interested to know what stayed with you most. Was it the idea that alcohol functioned almost like food, the fact that much of it was far weaker than people imagine, or the thought that brewing itself was built into the structure of household life? And as always, tell me where you're listening from, what time it is there, and what part of history you'd like to hear next. These slower journeys into the past are always better when they feel shared. If we stay with the same question a little longer, it also helps to think about what medieval people themselves noticed when they spoke about drinking. They did not describe it as an exotic feature of their age, because to them it was not exotic at all. It was ordinary enough to disappear into routine, yet visible enough to attract constant comment. Household accounts recorded purchases of grain, malt, and wine. Monastic records counted allowances carefully. Urban regulations returned again and again to price, quality, and public order. Sermons warned against excess not because alcohol was rare, but because it was everywhere. When something becomes woven into the fabric of life, society stops debating whether it exists and starts debating how it should be used. That is very much the medieval pattern. In fact, one of the clearest signs of alcohol's central place is how often people argued about moderation rather than abstinence. A society that expects complete avoidance talks one way. A society that assumes daily use talks another. Medieval Europe, in most places, was very much the second kind. Moral concern usually focused on loss of self-command, neglect of duties, waste of money, noisy behavior, sexual misconduct, quarrels, and dishonor. That tells us a great deal. The problem was not the cup itself. The problem was what happened when the cup disturbed the moral and social balance of the household or the community. This is subtle, but it matters. It means medieval people did not simply absorb drink without thought. They had standards. They expected limits. Their world made room for alcohol, but it also expected adults to remain recognizably responsible within that room. And that expectation becomes even more interesting when we remember how physically close people lived to production. Today, many people consume goods without seeing how they are made. Medieval people were far less insulated. They knew what grain looked like before it was brewed. They knew how much labor stood behind a batch of ale. They knew what spoilage meant. They knew the difference between fresh drink and tired drink, honest brewing and watered-down cheating, decent storage and waste. Because production and consumption were so near each other, drinking was not an abstract habit. It was tied to visible labor. In some ways, that closeness may have made people more practical and less sentimental about it. Ale was welcome, but it was also work. That practical mentality can be seen especially clearly in great households, monasteries, and other organized institutions. These places often ran on carefully managed provisioning systems. Bread, ale, meat, fish, pottage, cheese, candles, fuel, tools, cloth, and wages all had to be balanced. Drink was not floating outside that system as a luxury. It was counted within it. Servants might receive set rations. Monks might drink according to rule, season, or local custom. Guests might be offered better quality than ordinary members of the house. This means alcohol belonged not only to pleasure but to administration. It had to be measured, stored, distributed, and justified. The more organized the household, the more visible this becomes. And in a quiet way, that is another answer to our original question. Medieval people drank often because their societies planned for regular drinking. There is also something revealing in the difference between feast and routine. Feasts stand out in the historical imagination because they are colorful. Long tables, rich foods, banners, music, ceremony, and flowing drink are easy to picture. But a feast is useful precisely because it departs from routine. It tells us what abundance looked like by contrast with ordinary provision. Stronger drink, better wine, more generous serving, and looser behavior during festive moments only make sense because daily life was more measured. The feast was not the whole system. It was the heightened version of a system people already understood. In other words, medieval drinking culture had gradations. There was weak and strong, ordinary and special, household and public, nourishing and celebratory. Once we notice those layers, the old stereotype begins to feel not only inaccurate, but almost too blunt to be interesting. Another point worth dwelling on is the body itself. Medieval people worked in cold weather, damp weather, and exhausting conditions. Homes could be smoky, workshops cramped, roads muddy, and winters long. A warm drink, or even a mildly alcoholic one, could bring immediate comfort. That comfort should not be dismissed too quickly as mere indulgence. In a world where daily existence could be physically wearing, small forms of relief mattered more. A modern person with central heating, reliable lighting, and plentiful snacks lives inside a web of comforts so common they are almost invisible. Medieval people often did not. Their satisfactions were simpler, more local, and sometimes more necessary. A mug of ale by the fire after labor belonged to that world of modest relief. At the same time, medieval people were also highly sensitive to status, and drink expressed that in countless ways. The quality of a host could be judged by what was set before a guest. Imported wine, fine vessels, better brewing, generous portions, and orderly service all communicated rank. A noble household that served poor drink to honored visitors was failing in more than taste. It was failing in reputation. Even among ordinary people, the ability to offer a guest something decent mattered. Hospitality was a moral practice as much as a social one. To provide drink was to show that one's household was functioning, that one recognized mutual obligation, that one belonged to a civilized order. Here again, alcohol was doing more than one job at once. This is why the phrase drunk most of the time is so misleading. It draws attention only to bodily effect, and even then in an exaggerated way. Medieval people would likely have understood the question differently. They might have answered not by describing intoxication, but by describing habit, ration, meal, labor, feast, neighborliness, or obligation. To them, the cup was not merely an instrument of altered consciousness. It was a normal object in the choreography of daily life. What matters historically is not only how it made people feel, but where it sat in the structure of the day. Morning, meal, work break, guest welcome, religious observance, market stop, evening rest. Once you place drink into time, rather than treating it as a single dramatic event, the medieval pattern becomes far easier to understand. The same is true if we place it into the landscape. Villages were not uniform. Some had reliable wells. Some sat near moving water. Some were healthier than others. Some urban neighborhoods were more crowded and less sanitary. Some regions had stronger brewing traditions. Some had easier access to wine. Some relied more heavily on cider or perry. The result was not one universal medieval experience, but a patchwork of local arrangements. This matters because simple claims about the entire Middle Ages are often too broad to be satisfying. History gets richer when it allows for variation. In one place, ale may have been the unquestioned staple. In another, wine may have carried both daily and ceremonial importance. In another, public drinking establishments may have shaped social life more strongly than in scattered rural communities. The broad pattern is real, but the local texture is where it becomes meaningful. And local texture helps us understand another quiet truth. Much of medieval life was repetitive, and repetition creates culture more powerfully than occasional spectacle. People woke, worked, ate, prayed, fetched, repaired, stored, and slept in rhythms that changed slowly across the year. Because alcohol accompanied so many of those recurring actions, it became part of the emotional atmosphere of life. Not always noticed, not always discussed, but there. The smell of brewing, the clink of vessels, the expected cup set down at a meal, the cask in storage, the awareness of whether supply was running low, all of that formed part of ordinary consciousness. The importance of alcohol, then, was not only in moments of visible drinking. It was also in the background confidence it gave to household routine. There is a final twist here that makes the subject even more human. Modern people often imagine the past as a place where necessity crushed pleasure, or where pleasure always looked reckless. Medieval drinking culture reminds us that those two things were often mixed together. A beverage could be practical and enjoyable. It could be socially expected and personally comforting. It could be morally acceptable in one quantity and shameful in another. It could strengthen community while also inviting concern. That complexity is exactly what makes the history worth listening to. Real societies are rarely built on one motive alone. They are built on overlapping needs, habits, fears, and satisfactions that only make sense when held together. So when we ask why medieval people were drunk most of the time, the best answer is that the question is pointing towards something true, but phrasing it in the wrong way. Medieval people lived with alcohol constantly, certainly. They consumed it far more routinely than most people in the modern English-speaking world do. But they were not simply lost in drink. They were living inside a material system in which fermentation was practical, familiar, and socially embedded. The real subject is not endless drunkenness. It is the everyday intelligence of adaptation. Grain had to be used. Labor had to be sustained. Hospitality had to be shown. Ritual had to be observed. Comfort had to be found where it could be found. Drink became one of the means by which all of that was done. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson left behind by this whole subject. The past often looks strange when we view it through a single word. Drunk, dirty, superstitious, primitive. But the moment we slow down and look at causes, routines, and meanings, those labels begin to loosen. In their place, we find people making choices within limits, solving problems with the tools they had, and building customs that suited the realities around them. The Middle Ages do not become less interesting when we remove the caricature. They become more interesting because the real story is rarely the loudest one. So as this part of the journey comes to a close, I'd love to know what detail changed the picture most for you. Was it the idea of ale as nourishment, the role of women in brewing, the way monasteries and great households organized drink so carefully, or the fact that frequent drinking did not necessarily mean constant intoxication? Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and what piece of history you'd like us to spend an evening with next. And if you enjoy these slower, more careful documentaries, subscribing is a simple way to return for the next one. For now, though, thank you for staying with the story and for taking the time to see the medieval world in a slightly clearer light. There is one more layer to this story that often goes unnoticed, and it may be the most revealing of all. Medieval drinking habits were not simply inherited from nowhere. They were part of a very long historical continuity stretching back through the ancient world and then changing shape over centuries. The Roman world had its own strong drinking culture, especially around wine, and many parts of medieval Europe inherited habits, expectations, and agricultural systems shaped by that earlier civilization. But when Roman infrastructure weakened in some regions, trade patterns changed, urban life contracted, and local economies became more dominant. Drinking culture adjusted with them. In some places, wine remained central. In others, ale and beer came to define everyday life much more strongly. So even within the Middle Ages, the story was not fixed. It evolved with political collapse, regional recovery, monastic expansion, urban growth, and changing agricultural practice. That long view helps explain something important. Medieval people were not preserving a strange and static custom. They were living inside a flexible tradition that adapted to the realities of each region and century. Early medieval society, with its more localized economies and reduced long-distance trade in many areas, often leaned heavily on what could be produced close to home. Later medieval towns, with growing commerce and stronger institutions, could support more organized brewing industries and wider exchange. This means the familiar image of the Middle Ages as one unchanging block of time is especially unhelpful here. Drinking in the world of an 8th century farming settlement was not identical to drinking in a 14th century commercial town. The pattern of frequent alcohol use remained, but the scale, organization, and social setting could change substantially. And once we notice change over time, another curiosity appears. The later Middle Ages were not simply an age of continuity. They were also a period of adjustment and pressure. Population growth, urban crowding, shifting prices, labor demands, climatic instability, and disease all altered daily life. The Black Death in the 14th century, for example, changed European society in countless ways, and one of its quieter consequences was to reshape labor relations, household structures, and patterns of consumption. When populations fell drastically, wages in some regions rose, diets could shift, and surviving workers sometimes gained access to better living standards than before. Drink was part of that wider material picture. Not always dramatically, not in exactly the same way everywhere, but as one element in the changed balance of work, food, and household provision. Once again, a familiar cup on a table can point toward much larger transformations. This is also a good moment to return to the question of trust, because historical topics like this often become trapped between two bad extremes. On one side, there is the romantic version, where medieval drinking becomes cozy, wholesome, and almost charmingly communal. On the other side, there is the mocking version, where an entire civilization is reduced to mud, ignorance, and permanent intoxication. Neither view is especially useful. The truth is more stable and more interesting. Alcohol was ordinary because it fit the medieval world, could nourish, comfort, and bind people together. It could also create disorder, sharpen inequality, and expose weakness. It belonged neither to pure nostalgia nor to easy ridicule. It belonged to life as it was actually lived. If we imagine a medieval household at the end of a working day, that balance becomes easier to feel. There is no need to romanticize the scene. The room may be smoky. The air may be cold at the edges. The food may be plain. Labor has been tiring, and tomorrow will demand much the same. Yet there is also structure. Bread has been baked or porridge prepared. Drink has been drawn or brewed. Family members and servants know their places. A guest, if one arrives, can be welcomed with something recognizable and sustaining. This is not abundance in the modern sense, but it is order, and order matters deeply in uncertain worlds. Alcohol, in its quiet way, helped maintain that order. There is also something revealing in the language we use when talking about the past. Modern people often ask whether medieval drink was safe, whether it was weak, whether it was cleaner than water, whether children drank it, whether workers depended on it. All of those are fair questions, but underneath them lies another question, one we do not always say aloud. How did people live in a world so different from ours without feeling as though everything was precarious all the time? Part of the answer is that they normalized what we would find unusual. They did not wake each morning comparing their lives to modern sanitary standards, modern nutrition, or modern medicine. They worked within what they knew. Their routines gave predictability to uncertainty. Ale, beer, cider, and wine were part of that predictability. Not the whole answer, but certainly one piece of it. And that is why alcohol could become almost invisible in its importance. The most influential features of a society are often the ones no one thinks to explain, because everyone assumes them. Medieval people wrote laws about brewing, sermons about excess, and records about supply, but they did not need to compose elaborate explanations for why ordinary drink sat at the center of ordinary life. Simply did. We are the ones who notice it because we stand outside it. In a way, that is one of the pleasures of studying history. The obvious details of one age become the mysteries of another. A cup that meant little to them can open an entire civilization to us. There is also a final expectation reversal worth sitting with. We began with the idea of medieval drunkenness, but what this subject really reveals is medieval discipline. Not discipline in the modern bureaucratic sense, though there was plenty of regulation. Rather, discipline in the daily management of resources, labor, and custom. Brewing required timing. Storage required care. Provisioning required foresight. Hospitality required manners. Moral life required limits. The very normality of alcohol depended on a society that understood how to integrate it into work and order. That does not erase excess. It explains why excess could even be recognized as excess. You only call something too much when a norm already exists. Medieval Europe had that norm, and it was strong enough to shape household life for centuries. That point matters because it rescues the medieval world from flatness. The people of that era were not merely reacting to hardship in crude ways. They were operating within systems of knowledge, habit, and expectation that made their choices intelligible. They knew how to brew. They knew how to ration. They knew when drinking strengthened fellowship and when it crossed into shame. They argued about those boundaries because the subject mattered. And whenever a society argues repeatedly about moderation, fairness, quality, and access, it is usually because the thing in question is woven deeply into ordinary existence. So perhaps the better title for this whole question would not be why medieval people were drunk most of the time, but why alcohol was so normal that it came to define parts of daily life without always being noticed. That version is less catchy, perhaps, but much closer to the historical truth. Medieval people lived in a fermented world. Grain, fruit, labor, weather, worship, status, hospitality, and survival all met there. To drink often was not, by itself, a mark of collapse or indulgence. More often it was a sign that one was participating in the ordinary structures of society. And there is something slightly humbling in that realization. Every age has customs that feel perfectly natural from the inside and faintly strange from the outside. Future centuries may look back on our own habits with similar puzzlement. They may wonder why we relied so heavily on certain foods, stimulants, routines, or comforts. They may reduce us to a stereotype just as easily as we reduced the Middle Ages to one. Good history asks us to resist that temptation. It asks us to replace the joke with the pattern, the caricature with the system, and the simple answer with the more patient one. So as we gently draw this chapter to a close, think for a moment about what changed most in your mind while listening. Did medieval drinking begin to feel less like a sign of chaos and more like a sign of adaptation? Did the household matter more than the tavern? Did the weakness of everyday ale change the whole picture? Or was it the realization that alcohol could be nourishment, ritual, comfort, and risk all at the same time? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, what time it is there, and which history topic you'd like us to spend time with next. And if you enjoy these slower, carefully structured deep dives, subscribing is a quiet way to stay connected to the next one. For tonight, though, thank you for listening, and thank you for allowing the past to become a little more complicated and a little more human. As we take a final, slower look at this subject, there is one last detail that gently reframes everything we have discussed. It is the idea of expectation. Medieval people did not wake up wondering whether they should drink that day. In most cases, the expectation was already there, built into the structure of meals, labor, and social life. When something becomes expected, it stops feeling like a choice in the modern sense. It becomes part of the rhythm, like lighting a fire, baking bread, or beginning work at first light. And that rhythm shaped how people experienced time itself. Morning, midday, and evening were not just points on a clock. They were tied to actions, to shared habits, to what was eaten and what was drunk. A weak ale with a meal, a cup offered to a guest, a drink shared at the end of work. These were small anchors in the day. They gave a sense of continuity. In a world where much could go wrong without warning, that continuity mattered more than we might first assume. It also helps explain why medieval drinking rarely stood out to them as unusual behavior. From our perspective, the frequency seems remarkable. From theirs, it was simply part of being alive in that environment. That difference in perspective is easy to miss, but it is essential. When historians try to understand the past, they are not only asking what people did. They are asking what felt normal to them. And in the Middle Ages, regular drinking, especially of mild, everyday beverages, felt normal in a way that is difficult to fully recreate from the outside. There is also a quiet connection between alcohol and memory. Not memory in the modern scientific sense, but cultural memory, the habits that are passed down without needing explanation. Children grew up seeing brewing, tasting small ale, watching how drink was shared, when it was appropriate and when it was not. By the time they reached adulthood, these patterns were already internalized. No formal instruction was required. The system sustained itself through repetition. And yet, within that repetition, there was always variation. A better harvest might mean better drink. A poor season might mean weaker or scarcer supplies. A household in difficulty might cut back. A wealthy household might expand its offerings. Even something as routine as daily drinking could reflect broader economic and environmental conditions. In that sense, alcohol was not just a constant, it was also a quiet indicator of change. This brings us to one of the most understated but meaningful insights of all. Medieval people did not separate survival from culture in the way we often do. Today, we tend to think of survival as basic necessity and culture as something layered on top: art, music, ritual, preference. In the medieval world, those boundaries were less distinct. Drinking could be survival and culture at the same time. It sustained the body and it expressed identity. It provided calories and it reinforced social bonds. It was practical and it was meaningful. That blending of functions is what makes the topic so rich. It resists simple classification. It reminds us that human behavior is rarely driven by a single reason. When people drank, they were not just responding to thirst. They were participating in a system of work, belief, habit, and expectation that gave structure to their lives. And perhaps, in a quiet way, that is what makes this subject so well suited to reflection at the end of the day. It is not a story of dramatic events or sudden change. It is a story of repetition, adaptation, and quiet necessity. The kind of history that does not announce itself loudly, but reveals itself slowly as you begin to notice the patterns beneath the surface. So if we return one last time to the original question, why medieval people seem to be drunk most of the time, the answer feels calmer now. They were not lost in constant intoxication. They were living in a world where alcohol was integrated into daily life in ways that made sense for their environment, their economy, and their expectations. What looks excessive from a distance often turns out to be structured, moderated, and surprisingly rational up close. And maybe that is the most valuable takeaway. The past is rarely as strange as it first appears, and rarely as simple as it is often described. When we take the time to look carefully, even something as ordinary as a daily drink can open a window into how an entire society functioned. As you settle in after listening, I'd be curious to know what stayed with you most. Was it the idea of drinking as nourishment, the role of brewing in household life, or the way expectations shaped behavior without needing to be questioned? And as always, let me know where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what story you'd like us to explore next. For now, this has been another quiet journey into the past. Thank you for spending this time with me, and for letting history unfold at its own pace. And perhaps the most peaceful way to leave this subject is to step back even further and consider what it reveals about how humans adapt, not just in the Middle Ages, but in any age. Every society, whether ancient, medieval, or modern, builds its habits around what is available, what is necessary, and what feels familiar. In the medieval world, fermentation was not an optional curiosity. It was a practical response to the limits of storage, preservation, and nutrition. Grain could spoil. Water could vary in quality. Labor required energy. Communities required shared customs. And so, over time, a pattern formed, one that was repeated so often it became almost invisible. That invisibility is important. It tells us that medieval people were not constantly thinking about alcohol in the way we might expect. They were not asking each day whether to drink. They were simply continuing a pattern that worked, a pattern that had proven itself reliable enough to trust. And trust, in a world without modern infrastructure, was one of the most valuable things a person could have. There is also something quietly grounding in that realization. The medieval world, for all its differences, was still built on the same basic human needs we recognize today: nourishment, routine, connection, and a sense of stability. The forms were different, the tools were different, but the underlying intentions were not so distant. People wanted to get through the day, care for their households, fulfill their roles, and find moments of comfort where they could. And that is why the idea of constant drunkenness, while memorable, ultimately fades when placed beside the fuller picture. It is too narrow to explain a way of life that was as structured and as deliberate as medieval society needed to be. Fields were cultivated with care. Trades were practiced with skill. Households were managed with attention. Religious life followed rhythm and discipline. None of that aligns with a world permanently lost in intoxication. Instead, what we see is something quieter. A society that used what it had, adapted to its conditions, and built habits that supported daily survival. Alcohol was one of those habits. Not dominant in every moment, but present enough to matter, steady enough to rely on, and familiar enough to feel ordinary. There is also a certain stillness in that kind of life, even with its hardships. Repetition can be exhausting, but it can also be reassuring. Knowing what comes next, knowing how to prepare, knowing what is expected. These are forms of stability that modern life sometimes lacks. And within that stability, small rituals take on greater meaning. A shared drink, a prepared meal, a quiet evening. These are not just actions. They are signals that life is continuing as it should. So as we come to the very end of this exploration, it may be worth holding onto that image rather than the louder stereotype. Not a chaotic world of constant drunkenness, but a structured world where drinking was simply part of the pattern. A pattern shaped by land, labor, belief, and necessity. A pattern that made sense to the people living within it, even if it takes us a little time to understand it from the outside. And maybe that is the lasting value of questions like this. They begin with curiosity, sometimes even with a touch of humor, but they lead us toward a deeper kind of understanding. Not just of what people did, but of how they lived, how they adapted, and how they made their world workable. So before we fully close, take a moment to reflect on this. If you had lived in that world, with its rhythms, its limitations, and its expectations, do you think your habits would have been so different? Or would you, like so many others, have found your place within the same quiet routines? If we keep moving through this medieval world without hurrying, another important part of the story begins to appear almost by itself, and that is the relationship between drink and trust. In modern life, trust is often placed in systems we barely notice. Water arrives through pipes. Food comes wrapped, labeled, inspected, and sold through long chains of production that most people never see. Medieval people lived much closer to the source of the things that kept them alive, and because of that, their trust worked differently. They trusted what was familiar, what could be observed, what had been made in known ways, and what had already proven itself over time. Ale, beer, cider, and wine were not just consumed because they were available. They were consumed because they belonged to established patterns of confidence. People knew what they were, how they were made, how they should taste, and what role they played in the household and the wider community. That may sound like a small point, but it changes the feeling of the whole subject. The old stereotype suggests a society carelessly soaked in drink. The fuller picture suggests a society that depended on familiar methods of turning crops into stable, useful, and socially accepted forms. Brewing was not random. It was ordered. It required timing, ingredients, vessels, storage, and skill. A failed batch mattered. Poor quality mattered. Waste mattered. In a world where margins could be thin, nobody wanted to lose grain without reason. So even ordinary drinking carried with it the quiet discipline of production. That is one reason the topic becomes more interesting the longer we stay with it. It stops being a joke about drunken peasants and starts becoming a story about how people organized everyday life under conditions very different from our own. And once we notice trust, we also begin to notice memory. Not memory as a formal archive, but memory embedded in practice. Much of medieval life rested on repeated knowledge that was rarely written down in the way modern manuals are written. People learned by watching, repeating, correcting, and absorbing habit. A child in a brewing household would grow up knowing the smell of malt, the look of a vessel, the stages of preparation, the differences between a successful batch and a disappointing one. They would know when drink was served, who received what quality, how guests were treated, how much a laborer might consume, and what counted as inappropriate excess. By adulthood, these customs would feel as natural as any other household routine. This is worth pausing over because it reminds us that alcohol was not standing apart from medieval culture. It was one of the ways culture reproduced itself from one generation to the next. There is also a practical reason why this cultural memory remained so strong. Medieval people did not live in a world of endless variety. Their diets were narrower, their options fewer, and their reliance on staple goods much greater. Repetition was not simply a habit. It was a necessity. Bread, pottage, vegetables, occasional meat, seasonal produce, and ordinary drink formed the basis of existence for many people. Because daily life was built from repeated essentials, the things that appeared again and again took on a kind of quiet authority. Drink belonged to that category. It was not extraordinary enough to draw constant admiration, but it was important enough that its absence would have been sharply felt. In that sense, alcohol in the Middle Ages was often most powerful not when it was celebrated, but when it was assumed. This helps explain why moments of shortage could carry such emotional weight. A poor harvest did not just threaten bread. It threatened brewing as well. If grain stores were uncertain, then the household's routine was uncertain. If the quality of drink declined, that could signal wider strain. If a family or manor could not provide customary drink to workers, servants, or guests, it suggested pressure beneath the surface. In other words, alcohol was not only a sign of normal life. Changes in drink could also reveal when normal life was beginning to fray. That is one of the reasons historians pay attention to household accounts. provisioning records, and local regulations. Through them, ordinary drink becomes a clue to wider social and economic conditions. And the same logic applies to public authority. Medieval governments, whether civic, seigneurial, or royal, did not regulate alcohol merely because rulers were moralizing about pleasure. They regulated it because drink touched so many sensitive parts of society. Touched grain supply, touched pricing, touched labor expectations, touched public order, touched taxation. It touched the reputation of markets and towns. If measures were false, buyers were cheated. If brewing was poor, health and trust both suffered. If alehouses became disorderly, local peace could weaken. All of this meant that the ordinary cup on a table was connected to authority more deeply than we might first suppose. A society does not regulate something so frequently unless that thing matters at many levels at once. There is another gentle twist here. The more we study medieval drinking, the more it starts to look less like an exception and more like an example of a broader principle. Human beings do not simply consume substances. They build systems around them. Those systems include meaning, boundaries, expectations, identities, and habits. Medieval Europe did this with alcohol. It assigned drink a place within work, worship, hospitality, social rank, and domestic life. The result was not constant chaos, but a recognizable structure. That structure could flex under pressure, and sometimes it failed, but most of the time it functioned well enough to endure for centuries. This is another reason the subject keeps opening outward. It is not only about what people drank. It is about how societies make repeated behavior seem normal, responsible, and morally legible. If we imagine a manor house, a monastery, and a peasant cottage on the same winter evening, all three settings might involve drink, but in very different ways. In the manor house, quality and presentation may signal status. In the monastery, ration and discipline may be more visible. In the peasant cottage, the drink may sit closer to nourishment and necessity. Yet what unites all three is the sense that alcohol belongs there. It is not intruding from outside. It is part of the arrangement of life. Once again, this is why the phrase drunk most of the time can be misleading. It centers the modern fear of intoxication rather than the medieval familiarity of use. It notices the presence of alcohol but misunderstands its role. This is especially clear when we think about labor. Medieval labor was not only physically hard. It was often relentless in a seasonal way that modern office-bound societies can struggle to imagine. Planting, haymaking, harvest, threshing, woodcutting, hauling, milling, brewing, baking, washing, spinning, weaving, and animal care created a calendar in which human energy was constantly being converted into survival. In that setting, a drink that offered calories, comfort, and hydration at once carried obvious advantages. Not magical advantages and not advantages without risk, but practical ones. A worker pausing for drink was not necessarily stepping outside the system of labor. Very often, that drink helped sustain the system itself. There is also something emotionally revealing in the fact that alcohol could bridge the distance between necessity and celebration. In modern thinking, we often separate basic consumption from special indulgence very sharply. Medieval societies did not always do that. The same broad category of drink could appear at a plain midday meal and also at a feast, though naturally in different quality and quantity. This created a continuity between ordinary days and festive days. The feast did not introduce an entirely new substance. It intensified something already known. That gave drink a ceremonial flexibility. Could serve habit and pleasure at once. Could be plain or elevated, humble or prestigious, depending on context. That flexibility made it exceptionally useful in a world where the boundaries between subsistence, ritual, and sociability were constantly overlapping. And perhaps that overlap is the key to understanding medieval life more broadly. Modern people often like neat categories. Food is one thing, religion is another, work is another, pleasure is another. But in many historical societies, those categories sat much closer together. A religious calendar shaped labor. Household production shaped social standing. Seasonal scarcity shaped ritual and diet. Drink sat inside all of that. It could be part of Lent or feast, part of wage or welcome, part of prayerful discipline or convivial gathering. This is why even a narrow topic like everyday alcohol can become so large once we examine it properly. It touches nearly every major structure of life. The role of climate should not be underestimated either. Colder regions naturally encourage different habits from warmer ones, not only in what could be grown, but in what kinds of drink became normal. The local field, orchard, and vineyard-shaped taste long before any abstract idea of preference entered the picture. People often liked what their world could support. That may sound obvious, but it is one of the most powerful forces in history. Custom often grows from practicality and then later feels natural, even inevitable. Generations can inherit what began as adaptation and come to treat it as tradition. Medieval drinking culture followed that path repeatedly. What worked in one region over time became normal. What became normal then felt right. What felt right was defended, repeated, and folded into identity. So when later generations, including our own, look back and ask why these people drank so much, part of the answer is that they were not experiencing it as an unusual amount. They were experiencing it as ordinary life. That distinction is easy to say, but it deserves to be held in the mind for a moment. Most people in any age do not think of themselves as participating in strange historical customs. They think of themselves as doing what makes sense. Medieval people were no different. Their routines belonged to them with the same quiet force that our own routines belong to us. This also means that criticism of drunkenness in medieval sermons and moral writing should be read carefully. Such criticism does not prove that all drinking was excessive. Quite the opposite, in a way. It proves that society had ideals of proper conduct and that alcohol was close enough to daily life to require moral boundaries. If drinking had been rare, its regulation would have had a different tone. Because it was common, it had to be governed from within. Moralists were not usually trying to erase drink from society altogether. They were trying to defend measure against excess, order against disorder, responsibility against humiliation. Those distinctions tell us a great deal about how deeply normalized alcohol already was. We can see something similar in literature and storytelling. Medieval tales, songs, jokes, and moral examples often include drinking not as an exotic event, but as part of recognizably human behavior. Characters feast, boast, overreach, celebrate, sin, repent, host, and fail, often with drink somewhere nearby. That literary familiarity mirrors social familiarity. It tells us audiences understood these settings instinctively. The cup in a story needed no elaborate explanation. It was already part of the world people knew. And the more this familiarity accumulates, the more the central lesson begins to settle. Medieval people were not simply drunk because they enjoyed being drunk. They lived in societies where alcohol occupied the space between staple and pleasure, between nourishment and ritual, between domestic necessity and public economy. That is a much richer and more stable explanation than the stereotype allows. It also gives the listener a more humane view of the past. We stop laughing at a civilization from a distance and start noticing how intelligently it adapted to its own conditions. There is, perhaps, something quietly respectful in that shift. The Middle Ages can seem remote, but the people of that time were engaged in the same fundamental task that all people face, turning uncertain circumstances into workable routines. They did this with the land they had, the tools they knew, the beliefs they inherited, and the communities they depended on. Drink was one of the ordinary instruments by which that work was done. Not the only one, not always a benign one, but a central one nonetheless. And if we let the subject rest there for a moment, the old title begins to sound less like a description and more like a doorway. It attracts attention by suggesting absurdity, but once we pass through it, we find order, adaptation, hierarchy, labor, religion, memory, and trust. In that sense, the real reward of the topic is not the answer itself. It is the larger view of medieval life that the question accidentally opens. So if you continue listening in this calm spirit, it may be worth asking yourself not only whether medieval people were drunk most of the time, but what ordinary modern habits of our own might look equally strange when seen from centuries away. Which parts of our daily routines are so familiar that we no longer explain them, and what would a future historian discover if they paused over them as patiently as we have paused over the medieval cup? If we continue from there, still moving at the same steady pace, another part of the medieval picture becomes clearer, and that is the way alcohol sat inside the chain of obligations that held society together. Medieval life was not mainly organized around personal preference in the modern sense. It was organized around duty, custom, rank, season, and necessity. A lord owed certain forms of provision to retainers and servants. A monastery owed regulated sustenance to its members. A household head owed hospitality to guests and care to dependents. Villagers owed labor, rents, and service. Masters owed food and drink to those who worked within their household economy. In such a world, drink was not simply something someone reached for because they fancied it. It was often part of what one person was expected to provide to another. That detail matters because it shifts the subject from consumption to relationship. A cup of ale handed to a laborer during a long day in the fields was not only a drink. It was part of the moral economy of work. It acknowledged effort, restored energy, and confirmed that the structure of obligation was functioning as it should. A guest welcomed with wine or ale was not merely being refreshed. They were being recognized, placed, and honored according to the customs of the house. A monk receiving a measured daily ration was not simply indulging in comfort. He was participating in a disciplined communal order where provision had been thought through in advance. Once drink is seen in those terms, it becomes harder to imagine medieval society as casually saturated with chaos. The use of alcohol was often structured by expectation long before it was shaped by appetite. This is one reason why household accounts can feel so revealing even when they appear dry on the surface. Lists of grain, casks, vessels, purchases, and allowances may not sound dramatic, but they preserve the quiet machinery of life. They show us that drinking habits were supported by organization. Someone had to decide how much grain could be spared for brewing. Someone had to manage storage. Someone had to monitor use. Someone had to respond when supplies ran low or when quality failed. In wealthier settings, those responsibilities might be distributed among stewards, cellars, or other officers. In humbler settings, they rested within the family itself. Either way, drink belonged to management, and management implies foresight. The medieval world was often precarious, but it was not thoughtless. That is another point worth lingering over, because the caricature of the Middle Ages often depends on a refusal to notice practical intelligence. Medieval people may not have had modern chemistry or public health systems, but they had observation, habit, correction, and long experience. They knew which wells were dependable and which were suspect. They knew that some drink turned quickly, that some batches were better than others, that weather affected results, that dishonest sellers watered down their goods, and that stale or spoiled drink disappointed everyone. Practical knowledge accumulates even without modern theory. Much of medieval life depended on that kind of accumulated knowing. Fermentation was part of it. So when we ask why people drank so often, we are also asking how medieval people used repeated experience to stabilize ordinary life. There is also a strong seasonal rhythm behind all of this. The medieval year was not a smooth line. It was a cycle of intense demands, short windows, and recurring uncertainties. Autumn might bring grain and brewing opportunities. Winter emphasized storage, rationing, and careful management. Spring brought its own hunger risks in some places, especially as supplies thinned before new growth arrived in abundance. Summer could mean hard labor under pressure, particularly in preparation for harvest. Drink moved through all of these seasons differently, but always in relation to them. A household did not simply drink in the abstract. It drank from its stores, from its recent production, from its expectations about what must last, and from its understanding of what the coming months would demand. That seasonality gave alcohol a very different place in life than it tends to have in a modern supermarket economy. And once again, that practical rhythm overlapped with emotion. Scarcity always sharpens feeling. If a family had enough ale or beer, enough bread, enough fuel, enough salt, enough preserved food, then the world felt more manageable. If one of those elements weakened, anxiety rose. So the presence of ordinary drink could carry reassurance that went beyond taste or habit. It signaled that the household still held together, that stores still existed, that the work of the previous months had not been wasted. In this way, the drink on the table could represent invisible labor already completed and invisible hope still being projected forward. Medieval people may not have spoken of it in those abstract terms, but they lived inside that logic constantly. Another dimension appears when we think about roads, markets, and travel. Medieval movement could be slow, uncertain, and tiring. Roads varied in quality. Weather altered everything. Inns, taverns, monasteries, and households offering hospitality became important points in the experience of travel. For the traveler, alcohol was not simply pleasure on the road. It was part of the infrastructure of stopping, eating, warming up, and re-entering a human environment after the discomfort of distance. In many times and places, the offer of drink marked the transition from exposure to shelter. That gives alcohol a spatial meaning as well as a social one. It helped define where one had arrived, whether in a village, a market town, a religious house, or a noble household. The more we widen the frame, the more alcohol begins to look like one of the threads that stitched medieval life together across class differences. The quality varied enormously. The meaning changed from one setting to another. But nobles, monks, merchants, artisans, laborers, servants, and peasants all inhabited worlds in which drink was normal. They did not all drink the same thing, and they certainly did not drink under the same conditions, yet the shared familiarity mattered. It created points of contact across a society otherwise marked very sharply by hierarchy. A lord's wine and a laborer's weak ale did not erase inequality. Far from it, but the centrality of drink to everyday provision and sociability was one of the common facts of life recognized across ranks. That shared familiarity also helps explain why alcohol appears so often in moral and legal discourse. Medieval authorities were not trying to regulate something marginal. They were trying to shape behavior around something deeply woven into life. That is a very different task. It is easier to ban what is rare than to moderate what is ordinary. Because drink was ordinary, the challenge was always to distinguish proper use from excess, fair trade from cheating, welcome conviviality from dangerous disorder. Those distinctions appear again and again because society needed them again and again. The cup itself was not the crisis. The question was how to keep a normal and useful part of life from turning into waste, shame, or public trouble. This is where the alehouse becomes especially interesting again. Not because it was always wild, but because it concentrated many of these tensions in one place. It was a site of refreshment, commerce, companionship, and rumor. It could support local economy and local fellowship. It could also provoke anxiety in authorities who worried about idleness, argument, or loose behavior. The same establishment could be seen as necessary by one observer and suspect by another. That ambiguity is historically important. It reminds us that alcohol was never only a substance. It was a setting for social interaction, and social interaction is always harder to control than a commodity on a shelf. Gender adds further complexity. We have already touched on the role of women in brewing, but the subject opens wider the longer one looks at it. When brewing was embedded in household routine, women's labor could be central to sustaining both family and local exchange. A woman who brewed well was not merely preparing drink. She was contributing to the stability, reputation, and possibly the income of the household. At the same time, public drinking spaces could be morally charged in ways that exposed women to scrutiny different from that faced by men. The social meanings of drinking, serving, brewing, and appearing in certain spaces were not distributed evenly across gender. So once again, alcohol becomes a window onto much larger patterns. Labor, propriety, authority, and the shifting line between household work and market activity. Technology, too, continues to matter in a quiet way. The spread of techniques, ingredients, and storage practices changed what kinds of drink were possible and profitable. Hopped beer, for example, had advantages in keeping quality that made broader trade more feasible in some regions. Better storage meant less waste. Larger-scale production meant more commercial opportunity. These practical developments could slowly alter taste, economy, and social practice without any dramatic single turning point. A medieval person might simply notice that certain drinks were becoming more common, more available, or more desirable. Historians, looking back, can see the deeper pattern. Technology does not merely improve convenience. It changes culture by altering what becomes normal. And normality, perhaps more than anything else, is the heart of this topic. It is tempting to keep returning to the word drunk because it is vivid, but the more faithful word is ordinary. Medieval people drank because drink was ordinary. Ordinary in meals, ordinary in labor, ordinary in hospitality, ordinary in institutions, ordinary in discipline, ordinary in celebration, ordinary in worry, ordinary in memory. That does not mean harmless. It does not mean universal in exactly the same way everywhere. It does not mean there were no abstainers, no critics, no moments of excess, no painful consequences. It means only that a society can be deeply shaped by something without constantly treating it as exceptional. That may also be why the subject feels so absorbing to modern audiences. It invites a shift in perspective. At first, one thinks of alcohol as an event. Then slowly, one realizes that for medieval people it was often more like weather, furniture, or bread. Something present enough to structure life without demanding daily explanation. Once that realization settles in, the medieval world begins to feel less theatrical and more inhabited. We start to sense rooms, routines, measures, expectations, and countless repeated actions that gave shape to existence. The past becomes quieter and somehow more real. There is another subtle reversal hidden here as well. Modern people often assume that choice produces freedom. Medieval life, by contrast, was thick with customs that limited choice but also reduced uncertainty. You drank what your household made, what your region produced, what your status allowed, what your season provided. That may sound restrictive, and in many ways it was. Yet it also created a certain clarity. People knew what was expected at table, in work, in hospitality, and in feast. That predictability could be deeply valuable in a world where so many larger forces remained beyond anyone's control. Drink was one small part of that wider fabric of predictability. And from there, the line between material life and mental life becomes easier to understand. Historians sometimes speak of mentality, by which they mean not intelligence, but the habitual ways people understood the world around them. Medieval drinking belonged to that level of culture. It was embedded not only in what people did, but in what they assumed. It helped define what counted as a proper meal, a respectable household, a generous host, a fair employer, a disciplined religious life, a festive occasion, or a shameful excess. Those categories were lived long before they were analyzed. The cup on the table carried meanings people had absorbed from childhood and rarely needed to articulate. So the deeper we go, the more the original question opens into a broader answer. Medieval people were not drunk most of the time in the crude modern sense of constant heavy intoxication. Rather, they lived in a civilization where fermented drink was so integrated into subsistence, work, custom, hierarchy, and hospitality that frequent consumption became part of the unnoticed architecture of life. The architecture is the key. Once we see the beams and supports, the whole house looks different. And if we keep following that architecture, we naturally begin asking what other ordinary medieval habits have been flattened by modern shorthand in much the same way. How many practices that seem absurd from a distance would begin to look sensible if we restored their context? How many jokes about the past survive mainly because the real explanation takes longer to tell? That, perhaps, is one of the quiet rewards of this kind of history. It asks for patience, and in return it gives back depth. If we continue still further into the texture of medieval life, another useful way to understand this world is to look not only at what people drank, but at when they drank and how those moments were distributed across the day. Modern listeners often imagine alcohol as something set apart from normal activity, reserved for evenings, weekends, feasts, or deliberate leisure. In much of medieval Europe, the boundaries were different. Drink could appear in the morning with food, later in the day with labor, at midday as part of a meal, in the evening as part of household rest, and in between as refreshment offered in specific contexts. That pattern does not mean everyone was heavily intoxicated from dawn to dusk. Rather, it shows that fermented drink was built into the rhythm of ordinary time. The day itself was punctuated by cups, meals, pauses, and expectations that made alcohol feel less like an interruption and more like part of the day's natural order. That rhythm matters because routine is one of the strongest forces in any society. A thing done occasionally can remain visible as a choice. A thing done continually begins to shape the structure of life itself. Medieval drinking habits belonged very much to the second category. Once weak ale or similar drinks became expected at ordinary points in the day, the line between nourishment and beverage grew thinner than it is in modern culture. People were not necessarily trying to alter their mood in any dramatic sense. Very often they were simply participating in an inherited pattern of eating and drinking that supported labor, digestion, sociability, and familiarity. This helps explain why the stereotype of constant drunkenness can feel persuasive from a distance while becoming less convincing the closer one looks. The frequency was real. The meaning attached to that frequency was not the same as ours. And when we think about meals, we begin to see another layer of explanation. Medieval diets, especially among ordinary people, could be repetitive and heavily dependent on staples. Bread, pottage, onions, leeks, beans, peas, oats, rye, barley, cabbage, and whatever local produce or small additions were available formed much of the daily table for many households. Meat might appear irregularly or in small amounts depending on wealth, season, and religious observance. Fish could matter in some places and on some days. Cheese and eggs might appear when possible. In that setting, drink did more than satisfy thirst. It rounded out meals, softened hard bread, accompanied simple food, and made repetition easier to bear. When life is built from staples, anything that adds calories, familiarity, and comfort becomes more important than it might in a modern world of endless alternatives. This is one reason medieval drinking habits also intersect with the history of boredom, though medieval people would not have described it in those terms. Their lives were laborious, but they could also be monotonous in ways that modern listeners rarely pause to imagine. The same tasks returned with the same seasons. The same foods reappeared with modest variation. The same obligations governed day after day. Shared drink, even weak and ordinary drink, introduced a small but dependable pleasure into that repetition. Not a grand escape, not a theatrical indulgence, but a modest softening of life's rough edges. This quiet role of pleasure matters historically. It reminds us that medieval people were not only surviving, they were also seeking bearable forms of comfort inside the limits of their world. There is, too, a social intelligence in the way drink managed transitions. It could mark the shift from labor to rest, from stranger to guest, from transaction to welcome, from ordinary meal to feast, From private household space to semi-public gathering, a cup offered at the right moment did social work. It eased awkwardness, confirmed roles, and signaled that one part of the day or one mode of interaction had given way to another. This kind of subtle social labor is easy to underestimate because it leaves only indirect traces. Yet, in pre-modern societies, where formal institutions were fewer and social expectations more immediate, such gestures carried real weight. Drink was not the only medium of that transition, but it was a powerful one because it was so familiar and so widely understood. The same familiarity also made it useful in binding together people who lived under one roof but did not occupy equal positions. A medieval household was often not just a nuclear family in the modern sense. It might include kin, servants, apprentices, hired laborers, dependents, and occasional guests. Feeding such a household required planning, hierarchy, and repeated acts of distribution. Who received what, when, and in what quantity reflected rank, custom, age, and function. Drink was part of that daily choreography. Better ale or wine might go to the master's table or to honored visitors. Weaker drink might be consumed more broadly. Special occasions might temporarily blur distinctions or emphasize them further. This means that alcohol was not only an expression of community. It was also an instrument through which hierarchy was felt and reproduced, and that, in turn, opens a wider view of medieval inequality. The rich did not simply drink more. They drank differently. They had access to higher quality, greater variety, imported wines, finer vessels, and more elaborate occasions of consumption. Drink could become a language of prestige. The poor, meanwhile, relied much more closely on local production, household brewing, and weaker forms of drink tied to staple grains. Yet, because alcohol in some form was common across society, it gave the illusion of shared experience while still preserving real differences. This is a very medieval pattern. Many institutions in medieval life appeared universal while remaining sharply stratified in practice. Religion, law, labor, punishment, and hospitality all showed this mixture of common form and unequal reality. Drink did as well. The presence of alcohol in religious life deserves even more attention the longer we stay with it. It was not merely tolerated by Christianity in the medieval West. It was integrated into sacred practice. Wine at the altar was no peripheral detail. It was central. The Eucharist made wine part of the spiritual imagination of society, even in regions where wine was costly or imported. That did not mean religious authorities approved of all drinking or all settings of drinking. Quite the opposite. Their repeated concern with moderation, sobriety, and discipline shows that they understood alcohol's moral ambiguity very well. But the ambiguity is exactly the point. Medieval religion did not frame alcohol as simply evil or simply good. It recognized that the same substance could occupy sacred, ordinary, and dangerous spaces depending on use, context, and quantity. Few things reveal a civilization's complexity more clearly than the objects it both sanctifies and warns against. Monasteries are especially revealing here because they gather so many strands of the story together. They were religious houses, but also economic units, agricultural managers, centers of literacy, and communities of disciplined daily routine. In many of them, drink was supplied in regular, measured ways. Brewing could be technically skilled, and cellar management could be highly organized. Hospitality to guests mattered. Provision to the sick mattered. Rules had to accommodate ordinary bodily need while maintaining spiritual order. Monasteries therefore show us a form of medieval drinking culture that was neither casual nor purely festive. It was disciplined, accounted for, and woven into the timetable of communal life. They demonstrate especially clearly that alcohol could be normalized without being anarchic. The story also grows more interesting when we consider age. Modern audiences are often startled by the idea that children might consume weak ale or similar beverages. Yet again, the medieval context changes the meaning. Childhood itself was understood differently. Labor began earlier, households were more integrated, and the line between food and drink was less sharply drawn. A mild fermented beverage might be treated less as a forbidden substance and more as part of ordinary nourishment. This does not mean there were no concerns about behavior, no awareness of excess, or no distinctions between stronger and weaker drink. It means only that the assumptions organizing family life were not our assumptions. The surprise we feel tells us as much about the modern world as it does about the medieval one. Another question worth asking is how people perceived drunkenness itself. Medieval people certainly recognized it. They mocked it, preached against it, punished some of its consequences, and associated it with shame, folly, or loss of self-command. Literature and moral teaching make that clear enough. But because ordinary drinking was so common, intoxication was often understood relationally rather than abstractly. It became visible when it disrupted something. Labor, prayer, dignity, speech, hospitality, financial prudence, sexual conduct, or domestic peace. In other words, drunkenness was not merely a quantity consumed. It was a failure to remain within one's expected role. This is a profoundly social way of understanding behavior, and it suits the medieval world well. People were constantly being measured against the duties attached to their place in life. Alcohol became problematic when it caused someone to slip visibly outside those duties. That relational understanding also helps explain why taverns and alehouses could be regarded with mixed feelings. They were useful places, often necessary ones. They offered warmth, food, companionship, and commercial exchange. They helped knit together urban and rural life. Travelers depended on them. Locals used them as places of meeting. Yet they were also places where role boundaries could blur, where gossip spread, where arguments formed, and where the ordinary supervision of household life weakened. Authorities worried not because drink was unknown there, but because social control was thinner there than at home or in more regulated institutional settings. So the concern was less about the liquid itself than about the setting in which it was consumed. And settings matter enormously in history. A cup at the family table means one thing. A ration in a monastery means another. A shared pause during harvest means another. A merchant's wine at a civic dinner means another. A night in an alehouse on the edge of town means another still. The same broad category of drink can travel across social worlds while changing its meaning in each one. This is why any simple statement about medieval people and alcohol quickly becomes inadequate. The topic is not one thing. It is a network of connected practices, each shaped by time, place, status, institution, and season. The role of the body continues to sit quietly behind all of this. Medieval people were closer to hunger than most modern audiences are. Even in stable times, abundance could not be assumed. Work consumed energy quickly. Illness weakened bodies that had little reserve. Winters could narrow diets. Fasting rules altered patterns of consumption. In that world, anything that could deliver calories in an accessible way mattered. We should not reduce drink to nutrition alone, but neither should we neglect the nutritional logic that helped keep it central. Liquid grain remained grain in another form. Fermentation did not erase the fact that these drinks emerged from staple crops on which ordinary survival already depended. This also brings us back to one of the deepest historical corrections the subject offers. The Middle Ages were not irrational simply because their solutions do not match modern solutions. They were often highly rational within their own constraints. Brewing and habitual drinking made sense in relation to agriculture, storage, labor, social expectation, and available knowledge. That is not the same as saying every medieval practice was wise by modern standards. It is simply a reminder that people in the past were not fools wandering blindly through darkness. They were practical human beings managing risk with the means available to them. The more patiently we listen, the clearer that becomes. And patience really is the right word here. Topics like this reward slowness because the truth is layered. At first one hears a catchy claim. Then one notices a correction. Then another qualification. Then a wider context. Eventually what seemed like a funny historical oddity turns into a lens on economy, family structure, religion, labor, morality, technology, and emotion. This is often how good history works. It begins with a narrow doorway and opens into an unexpectedly large room. If we remain in that room a little longer, the medieval world begins to feel less alien. One can imagine the grain being stored after harvest, the mash prepared, the cask watched carefully, the household expecting its ordinary supply, the traveler hoping for a decent cup at the next stop, the servant receiving drink with food, the host thinking about what to offer, the monk living within measured provision, the preacher warning against excess, the official checking measures in the market. None of these scenes requires sensationalism. Their quiet repetition is enough. Together they explain far more than the stereotype ever could, and they remind us that history is often most revealing not when it shouts, but when it patiently accumulates ordinary detail after ordinary detail until a whole civilization begins to appear. If we bring this long journey gently toward its conclusion, the most useful thing we can do is gather the scattered pieces together and see what kind of world they form when viewed as a whole. By now, the old image of medieval people being drunk most of the time has probably changed its shape. It no longer looks like a simple story of ignorance or excess. Instead, it looks like the surface expression of something much larger. A society built around grain, labor, season, hierarchy, habit, and the endless work of turning uncertain resources into dependable routines. Alcohol sat inside that system so deeply that it became ordinary, and once something becomes ordinary, it can begin to disappear from view even while helping to structure daily life. That, perhaps, is the first lasting lesson. Medieval people were not constantly thinking about alcohol as a dramatic force. More often, they were living among its quiet uses. It stood beside bread as another transformation of grain. It stood beside water as another form of drink. It stood beside hospitality as one of the expected signs that a household or institution was functioning properly. It stood beside labor as a source of calories and comfort. It stood beside religion as both a sacred element in worship and a moral subject requiring restraint. And because it occupied all these places at once, It could never be explained by one modern sentence. Any single explanation, whether it is unsafe water or simple drunkenness, leaves too much out. The Middle Ages themselves become clearer when we notice this. Medieval society was held together not only by kings, wars, churches, and laws, but by repeated acts of provisioning. Someone had to bake, brew, store, measure, serve, and account for the ordinary things that kept life moving. These tasks were not glamorous, but they were civilizational in the deepest sense. Without them, fields could not be worked properly, households could not maintain themselves, guests could not be received, religious communities could not preserve order, and social expectations would begin to fray. The quiet cup on the table, then, was not a trivial detail. It was one part of the machinery of survival, and yet it would be too cold, and perhaps too modern, to describe the entire subject only in terms of function. Medieval people did not live by necessity alone. They also lived by familiarity, pleasure, custom, and shared feeling. A drink could be practical and still welcome. It could be part of subsistence and still offer genuine comfort. It could be mild, ordinary, and deeply associated with the warmth of company after labor. The same society that worried about excess also understood the value of sociability. The same moral world that condemned drunkenness also accepted drinking as part of respectable life. The same household that brewed for survival also brewed for its own ordinary ease. This is one of the reasons the topic has such depth. It refuses simple categories. It belongs to body and culture at the same time. There is also something quietly humbling in the way this subject changes modern perspective. We often look back at the past with a mixture of curiosity and superiority. We imagine that a strange old custom must be evidence of confusion, backwardness, or lack of discipline. But the more patiently we examine medieval drinking, the more it asks us to suspend that instinct. These were not irrational people drifting carelessly through an uncomfortable world. They were practical, adaptive people using the means available to them. They brewed because fermentation made sense. They drank because drink was tied to food, labor, trust, and habit. They regulated alcohol because it mattered, and because anything central to life must also be bounded. They criticized excess not because they rejected drink altogether, but because it was common enough to require moral control from within. That balance may be the most historically honest point of all. Medieval drinking culture was neither wholesome fantasy nor permanent disorder. It was a mixed reality, exactly as most human realities are. It provided nourishment, routine, and comfort. It also produced excess, waste, and social concern. It supported hospitality and household stability. It also required oversight because human beings do not handle any powerful habit perfectly. The temptation in popular history is to flatten such complexity into an image that can be remembered easily. But the reward of slower history is that it restores proportion. It shows how ordinary life was built, and how that ordinary life contained both prudence and weakness, both structure and risk. If we imagine the medieval world one last time, not as a stage set but as a lived environment, the picture feels calmer and more believable. We can picture a village household where brewing is part of domestic labor, not a special event. We can picture a manor where drink is distributed according to rank and duty. We can picture a monastery where provision is measured, disciplined, and folded into the regular rhythm of prayer and work. We can picture a town where alehouses serve as meeting places, watched with both dependence and suspicion. We can picture travelers arriving tired and cold, grateful for shelter and a familiar drink. We can picture a preacher warning that what is ordinary can still become dangerous in excess. And we can picture all these scenes happening not as isolated curiosities, but as repeated patterns across generations. Once seen that way, the original question begins to answer itself in a more satisfying form. Why did medieval people seem to be drunk most of the time? Because they lived in a world where fermented drink was normal, useful, widely available in some form, and integrated into nearly every layer of life. But were they actually drunk in the sense we usually mean today? Not generally, not constantly, and not in the exaggerated way popular myth suggests. Much of what they consumed was weaker than modern listeners imagine. Much of it belonged to meals, labor, and routine rather than to deliberate intoxication. Their society was organized enough, demanding enough, and morally attentive enough that constant helpless drunkenness could never have been the standard condition of ordinary life. That correction matters because it leads to a broader historical truth. The past often becomes distorted when we judge it by isolated fragments. One custom, one image, one repeated anecdote can come to stand in for an entire civilization. But civilizations are made of systems, and systems only become visible when we slow down long enough to see how one ordinary thing connects to many others. Drink connects to grain. Grain connects to land. Land connects to labor. Labor connects to hierarchy. Hierarchy connects to obligation. Obligation connects to hospitality, religion, and social order. Once those connections are restored, the medieval world stops looking absurd and starts looking coherent. There is, perhaps, a final quiet beauty in that coherence. Medieval life could be harsh, repetitive, and uncertain, but it was not shapeless. It had rhythms. It had expectations. It had ways of turning necessity into routine and routine into culture. Alcohol was one thread in that fabric, and because it was one of the more ordinary threads, it tells us a great deal about how the fabric held together. Sometimes the clearest way into a civilization is not through its kings or battles, but through the habits that seem too ordinary for its own people to explain. Bread, candles, wells, firewood, tools, and drink. These things carried the weight of the world more quietly than chronicles usually admit, and perhaps that is why this subject lingers in the mind. It begins with a question that sounds almost playful, but it ends with a recognition that daily life in the past was far more intelligent, structured, and adaptive than stereotypes allow. Medieval people were not simply drinking to forget their world. More often, they were drinking as part of the way they maintained it. The cup was tied to work, to welcome, to calories, to custom, to memory, and to moral discipline. In that sense, the real story is not about intoxication at all. It is about how societies make life livable. So as we let this history come to rest, it may be worth holding onto the gentler image rather than the louder one. Not a world of perpetual drunken confusion, but a world of managed uncertainty. A world where brewing and drinking had practical reasons, social meanings, and emotional textures that made sense to the people who lived with them. A world where the ordinary cup on the table could tell us about class, labor, religion, gender, technology, hospitality, and survival all at once. And a world that becomes more human, not less, the more carefully we study it. If there is one final takeaway, it is this: The Middle Ages were not simpler than our world, only different in the way their complexities were arranged. Their solutions grew from their conditions. Their habits were shaped by their risks. Their normal life, like ours, was made of countless things so familiar that people rarely stop to explain them. The historian's task is to stop there for a moment, to notice what everyone else passes over, and to ask what that ordinary thing made possible. In this case, the answer is surprisingly large. It made meals more sustaining, labor more manageable, households more stable, hospitality more visible, institutions more functional, and social life more familiar. It also created its own problems, its own anxieties, and its own boundaries, which is to say, it behaved very much like any deeply rooted human custom. And that is where the story naturally ends. Not with a joke about a drunken age, but with a fuller understanding of a society that used fermentation as one of its practical arts of living. The medieval world remains distant from us in many ways, but in this, as in so many things, it reveals something familiar. People made do with what they had. They built routines that worked. They wrapped necessity in custom until it felt natural. And in doing so, they left behind a world that, once seen clearly, is not ridiculous at all but recognizably human. So if you've stayed with me to the end of this long, quiet exploration, I'd love to know what changed most in your thinking. Was it the role of weak everyday ale, the link between drink and labor, the household side of brewing, or the fact that alcohol was regulated because it was so central rather than because it was so rare? Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what part of history you'd like to spend time with next. And if thoughtful long-form history like this is the kind of thing you enjoy returning to, subscribing is a simple way to stay connected to future documentaries. For now, though, we can let the medieval table grow quiet. The grain has been stored, the cups have been set down, the day's labor has passed, and the world we came to examine has become, I hope, a little less strange and a little more intelligible than it first seemed. Thank you for listening, and thank you for taking the slower road through history.